Your car is ready, madam.
Eleanor, wait! What is all this?
Grant Michaels signed the final divorce papers on a Tuesday afternoon in a downtown Charleston law office, sliding the pen back across the table to his soon-to-be ex-wife with a satisfaction he didn't bother hiding. "You'll never find anyone who wants a life as small as the one you've been living, Eleanor," he said, standing to leave before she'd even finished her own signature. "I hope whatever comes next for you is enough. I know it never was for me." Eleanor Vance-Sinclair said nothing. She simply finished signing her name, thanked the attorneys for their time, and walked out of that office into the gray Charleston afternoon with the same quiet, unhurried composure she'd carried through 11 years of marriage to a man who had never once, in all that time, thought to ask why a woman with her particular bearing had chosen a small rented house and a job cataloging rare books at a university library. Grant didn't notice the convoy until he was already crossing the parking lot to his own car. 12 black vehicles, gleaming, professionally driven, pulled to a slow, deliberate stop along the curb outside that law office. Drivers stepped out in matching dark suits, moving with the practiced coordination of a household staff that had done this exact procession more times than Grant could begin to imagine. A tall, silver-haired man in an impeccably tailored coat stepped out of the lead vehicle, crossed the sidewalk directly toward Eleanor, and bowed his head slightly before speaking. "Your Grace, the estate has been informed of the proceedings. We're ready whenever you are."
Your car is ready, madam.
Grant stood frozen in that parking lot, keys still in his hand, watching his ex-wife of 11 years step into the back of a Rolls-Royce with a calm, practiced grace he suddenly understood he had never once actually seen clearly, not in over a decade of marriage. Before I tell you exactly who Eleanor Vance-Sinclair really was, and exactly what Grant had just thrown away, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this story is worth staying for all the way through. Like this video if you believe quiet people are often underestimated in exactly the ways that eventually cost the people who dismissed them, share it with somebody who needs the reminder, and drop a comment below with the time and the city you're watching this from. I read every single one, and I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to understand exactly who Eleanor really was, and exactly why she'd spent 11 years of marriage letting her own husband believe
Your car
she was
is ready,
simply an
madam.
ordinary woman with an unremarkable life.
Eleanor, wait! What is all this?
Eleanor Vance-Sinclair was born into a lineage considerably more complicated, and considerably more significant, than almost anyone in her adult life outside her own immediate family had ever known. Her mother, Catherine Ashworth Vance, was the only daughter of the 11th Duchess of Ellesmere, an old, quiet aristocratic estate in the English countryside whose title and considerable land holdings had passed, according to a specific and unusual arrangement in the family's centuries-old charter, through the female line whenever no direct male heir existed. Catherine had met and married Eleanor's father, a black American engineer named Thomas Sinclair, while studying in the United States in her 20s, a marriage that surprised her own English family, less than the American press of the era might have expected, given how thoroughly the Ashworth family had, by that point, come to value substance over the rigid social expectations of previous generations. Eleanor grew up primarily in the United States, in a quiet suburb outside Boston, raised by parents who deliberately, carefully, chose to keep her childhood as ordinary and grounded as possible despite the eventual inheritance that awaited her. She spent summers at Ellesmere, the family estate in England, learning gradually over the years the full scope of what she would one day formally inherit. Not simply the ceremonial title of Duchess, which she would hold in her own right upon her grandmother's passing, but a substantial estate, considerable land holdings, and a family trust valued, by the time this story begins, at just over $1.1 billion. Eleanor's grandmother passed when Eleanor was 26, formally transferring the title and the full weight of the family's holdings to her. Eleanor made a decision, in the years immediately following that inheritance, that would define the following decade of her life. She chose to keep the full scope of her identity almost entirely private in her day-to-day American life, using her mother's family name, Vance, rather than the more recognizable Ashworth, and pursuing a quiet, deliberately unremarkable career as a university archivist and rare books librarian. work she genuinely loved and found meaningful entirely apart from any inherited wealth or title. Eleanor's decision to keep her background private wasn't born from any shame about her inheritance, but from a specific, painful pattern she'd witnessed throughout her 20s, watching how quickly and thoroughly people's treatment of her shifted the moment they learned about the title and the fortune attached to her name. She'd been engaged once before in her mid-20s, to a man who, she discovered only after their engagement became public within their social circle, had researched her family's holdings extensively before ever formally proposing, treating their entire relationship in retrospect as a carefully calculated pursuit of access rather than any genuine affection for Eleanor herself. That relationship's collapse, once she understood its true motivations, left her with a deep, lasting wariness about how quickly wealth and title could distort even relationships that had initially seemed genuine. She met Grant Michaels 3 years after that broken engagement, at a mutual friend's dinner party in Charleston, where she'd relocated for a research position at a university library specializing in rare historical manuscripts. She introduced herself simply as Eleanor Vance, deliberately omitting both the Ashworth name and any mention of Ellesmere, wanting, for the first time in years, to build a relationship entirely on its own merits, free from the complicated weight her full identity tended to introduce. I wanted, just once, to know if someone could love the actual person sitting in front of them, Eleanor would later explain, rather than loving an idea of status and access dressed up as a person. I know that choice cost me things eventually. I don't regret making it, even so. Grant Michaels worked as a real estate broker in Charleston, ambitious, image-conscious, the kind of man who measured much of his own worth by the visible markers of success around him. The car he drove, the neighborhood he lived in, the specific caliber of people he surrounded himself with socially. He was drawn to Eleanor initially by her genuine warmth and her quiet, unshakable confidence, qualities that felt refreshing, he told her during their early courtship, compared to the more performative social climbing he'd grown tired of witnessing throughout much of his own professional circle. Eleanor, for her part, found in Grant someone who seemed, in those early months, genuinely interested in her as a person rather than any external markers of status she'd deliberately hidden from him entirely. They married 18 months after meeting. In a modest ceremony Eleanor insisted on keeping small and simple, a choice Grant found endearing at the time, framing it, to his own friends and family, as evidence of Eleanor's refreshingly grounded, unmaterialistic character. The early years of their marriage were, by most measures, genuinely happy. Eleanor continued her work at the university library, finding deep satisfaction in her research and her quiet, scholarly daily life. Grant built his own real estate career steadily, and for a time, the contrast between Eleanor's understated presence and Grant's growing ambition seemed to complement rather than strain their partnership. The strain began slowly several years into the marriage, as Grant's own career success grew alongside an increasing preoccupation with status and image that Eleanor's deliberately modest lifestyle began to sit less and less comfortably alongside. By their 6th year of marriage, Grant had built a genuinely successful real estate practice specializing in Charleston's luxury property market, moving increasingly within social circles defined by visible wealth and status. Clients, colleagues, and friends whose lives looked considerably more externally impressive than the quiet, scholarly life Eleanor had built for herself at the university library. Grant began gradually, expressing a specific kind of frustration about Eleanor's lack of ambition, that surfaced more frequently at social gatherings, at industry events, in quiet moments at home where he'd once found her contentment endearing and now found it, increasingly embarrassing. "Don't you ever want more than this, Eleanor?" he asked her once during their 8th year of marriage, after a dinner party where several of his colleagues' wives had spent much of the evening discussing recent luxury travel and social club memberships Eleanor had shown polite, but clearly limited, interest in. "I'm building something real here. I need a partner who actually wants to be part of that world with me, not someone who'd rather spend her Saturday cataloging old books." "I love my work, Grant," Eleanor told him, genuinely puzzled by the specific resentment building in his voice. "I've never asked you to change who you are to fit some idea I have of what our life should look like. I'd hoped you might extend me the same understanding." Grant didn't respond to that directly, though Eleanor noticed, over the following months, a specific coldness settling into their marriage that hadn't existed in their earlier years together. Comments about her small ambitions, a growing impatience with her preference for quiet evenings over the social events Grant increasingly prioritized, an undercurrent of comparison to the more visibly ambitious, socially engaged women populating his professional circle. Grant met Victoria Ashford Hale, a marketing director at a prominent Charleston development firm, during his 9th year of marriage to Eleanor, at an industry event where Victoria's polished, socially confident presence stood in immediate, stark contrast to everything Grant had grown increasingly frustrated with in his own marriage. Their relationship began, by Grant's own later admission, as professional networking that gradually, over several months, evolved into something considerably more personal. An emotional affair that eventually became physical roughly 10 years into Grant's marriage to Eleanor, though he would successfully hide the full extent of it from her for nearly another full year. What Grant found in Victoria, he'd later tell friends, was exactly the kind of ambitious, socially engaged partnership he'd increasingly felt was missing from his marriage to Eleanor. A woman who seemed to want, visibly and enthusiastically, exactly the kind of status-conscious life Grant had built his entire adult identity around pursuing. Eleanor discovered the affair roughly 11 months into it, through a combination of Grant's increasingly obvious distance and a chance encounter with a mutual acquaintance who mentioned, without realizing the significance of what she was sharing, seeing Grant and Victoria together at a restaurant during a weekend Grant had told Eleanor he was traveling for work. Eleanor confronted Grant directly, without dramatics, in the same quiet, composed manner that had defined nearly every aspect of her adult life since choosing to keep her true background private. "I need you to be honest with me, Grant. Are you having an affair with Victoria Ashford Hale?" Grant, after a long, uncomfortable silence, confirmed it was true, offering an explanation that revealed, more clearly than perhaps anything else in their entire marriage, exactly how thoroughly his own resentment about Eleanor's quiet life had curdled into genuine contempt. "I need someone who actually wants the life I'm building, Eleanor," Grant said, during that confrontation, with a bluntness that stung considerably more than the affair itself had. "You've never once shown any real ambition, any real desire to be part of the world I'm creating for myself. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think some part of you has always known it too." Eleanor listened to that explanation with the same quiet composure she brought to nearly everything in her life, understanding, with a clarity that surprised even her, exactly how completely 11 years of marriage had failed to reveal to her own husband who she actually was beneath the deliberately modest life she'd chosen to build. "I think," Eleanor said finally, "that you've spent this entire marriage measuring my worth by a very narrow definition of ambition, Grant, one built entirely around visible status and social comparison. I chose this life deliberately, and I have never once regretted it, regardless of how small you've apparently always secretly considered it to be." She filed for divorce herself, within the following week, moving through the process with the same quiet efficiency she brought to her research work at the university, retaining an attorney and beginning the formal legal proceedings without the dramatic confrontations or prolonged conflict Grant had perhaps, on some level, been expecting from a marriage ending after 11 years. Grant, for his part, moved quickly to formalize his relationship with Victoria, the two of them beginning to appear together publicly within Charleston's social circles well before Eleanor and Grant's own divorce had even been finalized, a timeline Eleanor noted privately, without any particular emotional reaction, understanding it as simply confirming everything she'd already come to understand about her soon-to-be ex-husband's priorities. The divorce proceedings themselves moved swiftly, given both parties' mutual desire for a clean, uncomplicated resolution, culminating, roughly 4 months after Eleanor's initial discovery of the affair, in a final signing appointment at a downtown Charleston law office on an overcast Tuesday afternoon. Grant arrived at that final signing with a visible lightness Eleanor noticed immediately, a man clearly already mentally moved on toward the next chapter of his life, treating the entire appointment with a brisk efficiency that bordered on impatience. "You'll never find anyone who wants a life as small as the one you've been living, Eleanor," Grant said, sliding the pen back across the table to her once he'd finished his own signature, standing to leave before she'd even finished hers. "I hope whatever comes next for you is enough. I know it never was for me. Eleanor said nothing in response, finishing her own signature with the same steady, unhurried composure that had carried her through every difficult moment of the preceding months. She thanked both attorneys for their professionalism, gathered her belongings, and walked out of that office into the gray Charleston afternoon, carrying, though Grant would never have guessed it from her outward calm, a quiet sense of relief at finally, fully closing a chapter of her life that had required more careful self-erasure than she'd ever fully admitted to herself during the marriage itself. Grant didn't notice the convoy waiting outside until he was already crossing the parking lot toward his own car, keys in hand, already mentally composing the celebratory phone call he planned to make to Victoria the moment he was in his car. 12 black vehicles, luxury sedans and SUVs, gleaming despite the overcast afternoon, pulled to a slow, coordinated stop along the curb outside the law office, drivers stepping out in matching dark suits with the practiced, efficient coordination of a household staff executing a procedure they'd clearly performed many times before. A tall, silver-haired man stepped out of the lead vehicle, an impeccably tailored charcoal coat marking him immediately as someone of considerable standing within whatever operation this convoy represented. He crossed the sidewalk directly toward Eleanor, inclining his head in a small, formal bow before speaking. Your Grace, the estate has been informed of the proceedings. We're ready whenever you are. Grant stood frozen in the parking lot, car keys still in his outstretched hand, processing those words with a growing, disorienting confusion. Your Grace, a title he vaguely associated with British aristocracy, applied, apparently without any confusion or hesitation from this clearly professional household staff, directly to the woman he'd just spent the last several minutes dismissing as living a life too small for his own ambitions. Eleanor, Grant said, his voice carrying a confusion that had, within seconds, begun shading into something closer to dawning alarm. What is this? Who are these people? Eleanor turned to face him, her expression calm, unhurried, carrying none of the vindictive satisfaction Grant might have reasonably expected given everything he'd just said to her minutes earlier. This is my household staff, Grant, she said simply. I believe you're familiar, at least in theory, with the concept of ambition. I simply never felt the need to advertise mine the way you've always felt compelled to advertise yours. The silver-haired man, whose name Grant would later learn was Mr. Whitmore, the longtime estate manager for Ellesmere, stepped forward to formally introduce the situation Grant found himself struggling to fully process. Her Grace is the 12th Duchess of Ellesmere, Mr. Whitmore explained, his tone carrying the practiced, neutral professionalism of a man accustomed to delivering exactly this kind of significant information with careful discretion. The title, along with the associated estate and family trust, passed to her upon her grandmother's death 8 years ago. The family has, at her Grace's specific and long-standing request, maintained considerable discretion about her American residence and personal life throughout that time. Grant stood in that parking lot, processing, in rapid, disorienting succession, the full scope of what he was only now understanding about the woman he'd been married to for 11 years. A title, an estate, a fortune that, as he would later learn through public records and financial disclosures related to their now finalized divorce, exceeded $1.1 billion. 11 years, Grant said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The earlier confidence of his exit from that law office entirely evaporated. 11 years of marriage, Eleanor, and you never once told me any of this? I told you who I actually was, Grant, Eleanor said, her voice carrying no particular anger, simply a clear, settled honesty. You just never seemed particularly interested in that person. Once she stopped matching whatever narrow definition of ambition you decided mattered most. I wanted, for once in my adult life, to be loved for exactly who I was, without any of this attached to it. I'm genuinely sorry that turned out to be too small a version of me for you to actually value. The weeks following that parking lot revelation unfolded with a swiftness that left Grant reeling, processing not just the staggering scope of what he'd genuinely never known about his own wife, but the full, painful weight of exactly what his own choices had cost him. News of Eleanor's true identity spread quickly through Charleston's social circles once the initial shock of that public revelation became impossible to fully contain, particularly once several local news outlets picked up the story, drawn by the genuinely remarkable nature of a billionaire duchess having quietly lived as a university archivist for nearly a decade. Victoria Ashford Hale, upon learning the full scope of what Grant had walked away from. According to several accounts that later reached Eleanor through mutual acquaintances, grew notably cooler toward Grant almost immediately. Their relationship, which had seemed so certain and celebratory in the immediate aftermath of the divorce, unraveling within a matter of months as Victoria apparently reassessed exactly what she'd actually gained by encouraging Grant to leave his marriage. Grant's own professional standing within Charleston's real estate community, already dependent considerably on his reputation and social connections, suffered its own quiet erosion as the story of his divorce became a subject of considerable local gossip, several clients and colleagues privately expressing a specific discomfort about a man who had so publicly, so confidently, dismissed a woman of Eleanor's actual standing and character without ever having taken the time to genuinely understand who she was. Grant attempted to reach Eleanor directly roughly 3 months after that parking lot revelation. A phone call Eleanor answered mostly out of a lingering, practical need to finalize a few remaining administrative details related to their divorce rather than any genuine desire to reconnect. "Eleanor, I need you to know I've done a lot of thinking since everything came out," Grant said, his voice carrying a humility Eleanor had genuinely never heard from him throughout their entire 11-year marriage. "I said things to you in that office that I deeply regret, and finding out who you actually were afterward just made those words so much worse in my own mind. I don't expect you to forgive any of it. I just needed you to know I understand now, clearly, exactly what I threw away." Eleanor listened to his apology with the same measured composure she brought to nearly every difficult conversation in her life, though she noted, internally, a specific and important distinction in what Grant seemed to actually be grieving. "I need to ask you something honestly, Grant," she said. "Are you genuinely sorry for how you treated me throughout our marriage, for the resentment and the affair and the cruelty in that office? Or are you sorry specifically because you later learned exactly how much status and wealth you walked away from without realizing it?" The long silence that followed answered her question more clearly than anything Grant could have said aloud. "I think," Grant finally admitted, "it's probably some of both, if I'm being honest with myself. I want to tell you it's entirely the first one, but I don't think that would be true." "I appreciate the honesty," Eleanor said. "I think it's important for your own sake going forward, that you sit with that distinction clearly. I don't think I'm the right person to help you work through it any further." 2 years removed from that parking lot revelation, Eleanor Vance-Sinclair has stepped, gradually and deliberately, into a considerably more public relationship with her full identity than she maintained throughout her 11 years of marriage to Grant, though she has done so entirely on her own terms rather than as any kind of reaction to how that marriage ended. She continues her work at the university library, a role she has no intention of leaving despite now possessing the means to pursue an entirely different kind of life, work that continues to bring her the same genuine, scholarly satisfaction it always has, regardless of the title and fortune she's chosen to more openly acknowledge in her personal life since the divorce. She has taken a more active role in managing the Ellesmere estate and its associated charitable trust over the past 2 years, directing considerable resources toward literacy and historical preservation programs that align closely with her own professional passions. Work she's found deeply meaningful in ways that feel entirely authentic to who she actually is, rather than performed for any external audience. She has cautiously begun dating again in the past year, choosing this time to be considerably more transparent about her full identity from the earliest stages of any new relationship, having learned, through 11 difficult years of marriage, exactly how much clarity that early honesty can provide about a partner's genuine character and priorities. "I don't regret the years I spent keeping this part of my life quiet," Eleanor said, in a rare public interview addressing her unusual circumstances. "I learned something important about myself during that time, about the kind of ordinary, quiet life I genuinely valued and continue to value today. I simply learned, alongside that, exactly how important it is to be with someone capable of valuing that same ordinary life, rather than someone who only discovers your worth once a convoy of black cars arrives to remind him of it."
Thanks for tuning in and watching to the end. Drop your comments below.